We also won the Olympics in tennis, and that was also a very big event for us because we don't get the Super Bowls, we don't get, we've never won the World Cup or anything else, so those small achievements are really high for us. And this was a high point. And as well, Carlos Navarro, he's a motorcyclist, and he won the Paris-Dakar race a few years ago. That was big as well. And Marcelo Rios was #1 in tennis, not for very long, but he still received, after he won against Agassi and was #1, we received him and cheered him in our, in the parliament and all. So yeah. And of course we have 2 Nobel Prizes, Neruda and Gabriela Mistral. And the man in the middle is Barutao. He's been named saint a couple of years ago, and he did great things for the church, especially working for the poor. So these are much more important, I guess, than sports figures. But this is our people, and this is our basic, very common Chilean family. Okay, so this is how it all began. Before Spanish came, we had the Araucanos. Araucanos were very, they were a very war-oriented tribe. The Incas never could, they could never win them. So actually, the southern frontier of the Incas was their northern frontier of the Araucanos. But that evolved, obviously. Spain came in and they managed to get hold to the mid-north region of Chile. And then after long battles, and they got to dominate the Araucanos. So I want to bring you down to the 1810 period. That's when we got our independence. And it's quite a funny, I think it's a funny story because we weren't looking for independence. It just came out because Napoleon invaded Spain in that moment, first years of the 19th century, and suddenly Chile didn't have the head of governing the country. So what was to be done? They settled the council, and the council was settled with both Spanish and national Chileans. And once the national Chileans were in this little council, they found out, well, it seems that we can rule our country by our own. We don't need Spain anymore. And a lot of these guys had the influence of the Enlightened years, that's how we call it here, the Enlightened age. So they had been traveling through Europe and came back to Chile with all these new ideas from the US Revolution and the French Revolution. So once they belonged to this council, they kind of figured out that they could rule themselves. And that's how we actually fought for our independence. It wasn't that we were not fond of the king in that period of time. But yes, we did have a lot of fightings after that. And we finally got our independence in 1810 with the help of San Martin, that was an Argentinian soldier. And after that, we had a long period of maybe you could say economic growth and economic growth and stability. But we've always had some problems with the frontier because the Spanish, they didn't even care a lot because they had this Americas were part of Spain. So they didn't give any importance to what was the limit between Bolivia or Peru or Argentina. So this is how it looked before certain war I'm going to talk about. There was this region that's the desert region that the Spanish just said, north of that, and the north part of that desert is Peru, and the southern part of Chile. The southern part of the desert is Chile. But what happened in that sector, they didn't quite got into details. So what happened was that Chileans settled there with their salt companies, because salt was very big in that time. So you had a lot of small mining and salt industry in that region, and the Bolivians claimed that that was their region. So, you know, we had a diplomatic problem there that evolved eventually to a war in which the details, I don't want to get into the details, but we had a very big war with the Bolivian and Peruvian coalition. And this is kind of a very famous picture for us, because then this is the event that comes out to raise Arturo Prat as one of our heroic figures. And to make a long story short, we managed as a country to win this war, and actually the soldiers went into Lima. That's way north, more than they wanted to accomplish. And once they settled in Lima for a few weeks, they established what our frontier is now. That is much more than when we had in those years. So that's how Bolivia now has no stretch to the sea. That is still kind of a diplomatic issue for us, basically for them. And that's how we have our limit with Peru nowadays, that is in the city of Arica. And so this is what happened at the late 19th century. And at the beginning of what happened during the beginning of the 20th century is that with the Great Depression and the invention of new sources of artificial salt, our salt industry went down, our economy crumbled quite a lot. And then we had a lot of socialist movements coming in the country. So basically, the workers were, they thought that the government owned them, and they started striking, and we had a military coup in the beginning of the 20th century. So that's when all the socialist part of our country, or the socialist kind of feeling in our workers, began to build up. And just before getting to this, during the 40s and the 50s, we actually had a long period of socialist parties ruling the country by the name of the Radical Party. That's kind of left-wing. And they managed to get a lot of economic growth in our country because they had long policies of industrial construction for a country. That was very good. And that's how we get to Eduardo Frei in the 60s. This man was a socialist, he was a Christian Democrat. And that's kind of what you call the middle, it's kind of in the middle between left and right. But in the time being that he got elected, this whole socialist revolution internationally was very big. So he got some policies of the agrarian revolution settled down. That means that he settled the first grounds to give back the farm to the people. And that was, from my point of view, this obviously presentation is all from my point of view. So I think that was the first big moment that created a great feeling of socialism, and people had the first grasp that they could finally get to own a place or own a bit of farm, and that the rich families were not going to rule the country anymore. So after this, in 1970, we had elections, and Mr. Allende and Vladimiro Tomic were the two candidates. Tomic was the candidate for the right wing, and Allende was candidate for the left.